Hello, welcome to the news tutorial presented by the SHRDB. This is a tutorial acid-base equilibria on Cambridge, the reference Cambridge AS according to Laurie Ryan and Roger Norris. This is acid-base equilibria part 1, and here we are going to visualize some definition of an acid and a base. So you need to know that there are different definitions of acid and base, and this is according to number 1 Arrhenius, number 2 we have number 1 Arrhenius, number 2 Bronsted-Lowry, and number 3 Lewis definition. According to Arrhenius, an acid is defined as any species that is going to release hydrogen ion in solution and is going to bind with the hydrogen ion produced by a base in order to produce a salt and water only. That's an acid and base definition. Any species which produces hydrogen ion and in solution, and the base is defined as any species that produces hydrogen ion, and both of them bind in solution to produce a salt and water only. That's according to Arrhenius. The next definition was according to Bronsted-Lowry definition. Bronsted-Lowry definition defined an acid as a proton donor and a base as a proton acceptor. So we need to know that usually hydrochloric acid is HCl, and when it's dissolved in solution it produces hydrogen ion. You see that hydrogen ion is actually positive, so you can define an acid as a proton donor due to that hydrogen positive which is being released in the solution. That's why it's defined as proton donor. And a hydroxide is a proton acceptor. Now we need to know that this is a contrary for Lewis definition. Lewis definition says that an acid is instead an electron acceptor, and a base is an electron donor. So now in Bronsted-Lowry definition, it is applying mostly when you are involved in a solution, while in Lewis definition, acid and base are applying mostly when you are having gaseous state, like in organic chemistry. So now the next point that you have to note is a conjugate acid and a conjugate base. You need to know that when an acid dissolves in water, it produces a conjugate acid and a conjugate. When you have a species that dissolves in water, it produces a conjugate acid and a conjugate base. So how do you identify the conjugate acid and conjugate base? Initially you have been told that according to Bronsted-Lowry, the definition of an acid is a proton donor. So it implies that an acid is much more positive, is much more having positive ions in itself. So that's the difference that you are going to distinguish. So that in order to distinguish between an acid and a conjugate acid and a conjugate base, you are going to identify the molecule that is much more positive, the first point, and you identify the molecule that has much more hydrogen ion. That one is going to be the conjugate acid. So there are 2 points on how to identify the conjugate acid: the one which is much more positive and the one which is much more having hydrogen inside. And the second one, in order to identify the conjugate base, the one which is less positive and the one which has less hydrogen is a conjugate base. So now let's see in this case. In this case, hydrochloric acid, water dissolving. So the conjugate acid in this case is between HCl and Cl minus. You see that HCl is much more positive compared to Cl minus, which is negative. So this is the acid, this is a conjugate acid, and this is the conjugate base. So now let's see in this case, you have the acid, you have base. So let's say when you have ammonia which is being dissolved in water, the conjugate acid and the conjugate base is what? With ammonia here, it has NH and it has no one. So NH, this is one is NH4 and it's positive. So this is the conjugate acid, which is much more positive than the conjugate base. So now conjugate acid and conjugate bases. So here we say that NH is the conjugate acid and NH3 is the conjugate base. The next point that you need to visualize was hydrochloric acid. We said that this was the conjugate acid and this was the conjugate base, and this also the conjugate between HO and this is a conjugate acid and this is a conjugate base. These are conjugate pairs. So this is one conjugate pair and this is the next conjugate pair. So also here you have also this one conjugate pair and this other one conjugate pair. But between this one and this one, which is the conjugate acid and conjugate base, this one is much more negative, this one is much more positive. So this is the conjugate acid and this one is the conjugate base. So these are the different points to put in mind. So this is a conjugate pair. So this one is a conjugate acid and conjugate base. This is a conjugate base and this is a conjugate acid. And you need to put in mind that where you have the conjugate base acid, the base and acid should be placed on one side of reaction. Acid and base should also on other side of reaction. So that's another point not to confuse. So now in this you can also visualize weak acid. So we have strong acid that dissociate completely in solution as strong acid, so producing the hydrogen ion. they are strong acid, while weak acid are acid that dissociate partially in solution are called weak acid. So this is dissociate partially, so we have different so they cannot have a complete reaction. Their reaction, or the reaction of weak bases are actually of weak bases and weak acid are actually going to occur in equilibrium, because they cannot completely dissociate in water, while that of strong acid and strong base, they are occurring in complete dissociation. While bases dissociate completely in solution and produce hydroxide ion, while weak acid, weak bases, they dissociate partially at a small extent in solution. So these are different points. So the acid base equilibria part 1 is completed, and we see acid base equilibria part 2 in the next session. Thanks for your kind attention.